So my first question goes to Adrian, because I guess we just listened to your really amazing paper. But then I would also like Sean and Julia to give their opinion, because maybe this question can be applied to your practices too. So Adrian, you said you have no self-interest in writing this paper. So I was actually very curious to know, why did you feel the need of giving us such advice?
Well, number one, I really love giving people free advice. So that's the first thing. And I was invited to give a paper on this topic, and loving to give free advice on any topic, I, of course, accepted the invitation. But now, I guess, you know, the serious answer to your question is that, you know, I take this distinction between artistic language and conventional language very seriously. The artistic language is the language that I personally develop in my artwork, and that every artist develops in her or his artwork. And that language is idiosyncratic, it's unique, it speaks to some people, it doesn't speak to a lot of people. Sometimes it takes centuries for it to speak to people. And that's just part of producing art. You just have to live with that. The great thing about conventional language is that it is based on a shared set of criteria for meaning and reference. And so it enables people who may have virtually nothing else in common to communicate at a very basic level about issues ranging from the basic to the complex. And I think that really has to be preserved and protected. So anytime I find a term which has loaded political and social content being appropriated into another context in which it is made to do double duty, bringing the validation of the original context into a new context that is seeking validation, I get really nervous, because I feel that the main point and the value and the purpose of conventional language is being violated. And that's the way I felt when I first started hearing about artistic research. I, of course, understand completely that there are economic imperatives in the background of this development, and I take those very seriously. But I think that if artistic research is to achieve the kind of validation that it's seeking, it needs to follow a procedure that respects the requirements of ordinary communication. And it needs to use the concept of artistic research in a way which enables the artistic researchers to be intelligible to academic administrators, to granting fund panels, to foundations, to governments. And as soon as language starts getting this fuzzy, blurry, you know, sort of ambiguous use, which of course we can all do. You know, we can all do that anytime we like. It becomes harder to communicate, harder to convey the value of what it is you're trying to achieve, and therefore harder to get things done, like get money. So that's what really got under my skin.
Sean, can you also maybe explain about your own motivations? I guess maybe to...
Yeah, I'll do my best.
Thanks.
I'm afraid that my natural mode is kind of fuzzy. So... No, just wait. Just wait until I answer this question. Then you'll see how fuzzy I can get. I mean, I think I also felt uncomfortable when I first learned of artistic research, particularly within kind of a university context. And yet I found myself in a kind of art practice PhD. And so I feel at some level like maybe I ought to explain myself. Or, because in one way, I don't see it I don't see it purely as a way to justify myself to administrators in order to get money. Certainly, I'm there because I have a scholarship from the state of Australia. So, you know, these sorts of considerations are a part of it. But I think that there is even a question as to like some methodologies that might be sort of native to art. And so it doesn't need to look across to other fields to find more established ones. But then the question is, you know, what might those be? And especially because there's the kind of contradiction between the rigor of the other fields and, I mean, I think your paper sort of illustrated it so beautifully. But one thing that it made me think of was in my research in particular, I'm looking at the history of the essay form, for instance, which over its 500 years, and particularly in the last century with like Lukács and Adorno writing on it, and even prior to that, Walter Pater, this idea that it's something that's methodically unmethodical or systematically unsystematic. You know, so this kind of form that's already kind of embracing the contradiction between accepting sort of external constraints and developing an internal logic. To me, it seemed like, oh, maybe this is a conversation that didn't just start in the last 15, 20 years around artistic research, but it's been, you know, going on much longer with regards to systematic thought.
Yeah, well, it's hard for me. I think I need to quote Harry from his, like, I feel bad, actually, because for me it's difficult to understand from which position I should be talking now. The head of education of the Documenta 13, who's excessively argued for and against all those things, or like my own training, who's I did a dissertation on institutional critique that I couldn't get done in any art historical department in Germany, so I did it at the Art Academy in Vienna. And at that time, my professor was just implementing a PhD program there. So it's like a lot of different contexts for me going on here. Maybe like to be, you know, most bluntly, I'd say I feel like in my work and personally also no pity for the institution of language to be violated, and that comes from like the kind of third wave institutional critique work I've been studying and supporting, is that I believe really that the grammar is like it's a fundamental disciplinary mechanism that I think is important to unpack, not only in idiosyncratic ways, or like the poetry or the fuzziness that you have excellently, of course, outlined its limitations. But I believe, yeah, of course, you need, all the funding, and I'm not saying like any research or anything can be done without money whatsoever. That would be utterly naive. But I believe if that aim of ordinary communication, as you said, or like any kind of normative administrative policy would be the motivation of artistic research, I wouldn't want to do it, I guess. That's just like my response.
No, I was wondering, in Switzerland we have various examples now in the last 10 years maybe of experiences made between science and art to invite artists in residencies, for example, in the science department of the University of Geneva, or at the CERN in Geneva also, etc., with always very, I would say, good results, whatever that means. I mean, people are very enthusiastic about it on both sides, either the artist and the people the scientists that kind of discover art and new ways of seeing their own work. Is this kind of thinking that that is being more and more common a good way maybe to address your conclusions that you had in your talk, and also the idea of you said your first point was to say be also interested in the other disciplines, and yeah, well, this is kind of my question.
Well, I just want to say that this is really wonderful to hear. It's really wonderful because my experience among my colleagues in the art world, you know, my circle of artist friends, everyone's fascinated with science, really just fascinated, and wanting to know more about it and wanting to find out how scientists think. And, you know, and scientists, you know, particularly scientists who are involved in serious original research, they love talking with artists. They really, really enjoy it. So I think there's a potential for great synergy, to use a corporate term, that really has not yet been fully explored.
It also be applied. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, just as a small follow-up, but at the University of Melbourne, I'm involved in it's called Bio 21. It's sort of the Center for Free Radicals, and this is free radical chemistry, which is a sort of lone electron that, you know, with oxygen, and it makes has to do with the background behind aging and materials sort of decomposing and things like that. So it's that's the background. But I suppose that one of the most interesting parts about being involved in this is one time where we all met just to see the other people's faces, and we went on having a discussion for an hour or two about our place in the university, sort of like what we were expected to do and like how we found money within our particular departments. You know, there's just really practical kind of questions. It wasn't sort of like yeah, it was very mundane. It was sort of about like how we as occupants of a university, as employees, you know, with particular practices that are very specific and very different, yeah, us as artists and them as scientists, but to actually no longer be sort of imagining what the other one is acting like, because we do in the arts tend to kind of, I think, be really reductive when we imagine how other disciplines function. And vice versa. So.
Actually, then that just makes me want to connect to what Julia Moritz was talking about this morning, and you know, your work at the Kunsthalle Zürich. Julia was talking about the Younger Reading Group, which is a reading group taking place every Sunday, in parallel to an exhibition by Pauline Baudry and Renate Lorenz. Please correct me if I'm missing something. And I thought there was I saw some interesting parallel here, because actually they are very often bringing highly academic text, but they manage to take it out of this academic context in order to shed a new light on them, right? And I guess that because we're speaking about education and programming within institution, I thought there was actually a very interesting way to revive feminist discourse within the institution, but at the same time connect to the exhibition that was taking place at this time. And well, that was actually just a comment, but I'm sure you have something to say about that.
That's actually making it even more complicated, because I just decided to take on a little bit of the document ahead, but I can of course try to speak for the Kunsthalle too. No, I was just I just thought maybe in order to, it's hard to get it out of you, but to a little bit contextualize the statement B and the fascination with art and science that we know so much from. That was actually, I mean, really among the greatest experiences ever for me in art institutional work, is that of course, like this statement you chose is a newsletter announcement, right? It's not a definitionary. Not even, anything towards that. It's more just putting forward like a focus, that's just the responsibility document has to say like, okay, now after 5 years, we're going to focus on this. And what we did in a little notebook by Chus Martinez, who was the co-director, we all had this absurdist title, head of department was the title. So she made a little notebook in a series of the 100 notebooks on that notion of artistic research, where she puts forward, and that actually relates to a lot of what you said, like the Diogenes theater and to skepticism particularly, which was, you know, going back to when academia was just the place where people walked, you know, and look at sexus empiricus in particular, certain skepticist methods of doubt and like questioning and inquiring, which I think is an important motivation, or like an important, if only a footnote to understand how we use the notion of artistic research. And what she concluded with, and whenever I relate to the work there, and particularly the theory and programs that we did in conjunction with it, is it's actually more like simply just thinking about the search. I mean, the search as such. I mean, it wouldn't be anything like you argued for that would, you know, valorize or itemize artistic in particular. Again, that's more like the common denominator of like really searching towards something, but not just once, but like re-search it, like not, you know, being confident or satisfied by the existing knowledge to be acquainted or collected, but to kind of redo it in a way. So that was something, I think, just for like the general, maybe not methodology, because I'm always also more interested in method than the ology to it, but for that project. And of course, this is related to younger reading group, because that's where I come from. That was my last job. That's what I'm interested in. I'm super excited to see younger and younger and younger people doing it differently also. And what I try to also communicate non-verbally a little bit in the readings this morning, which of course were verbal, was the little, you know, how insecure you sometimes are reading things loud, and how these words on the page, the text and your utterance of it, what it does to it, and how this is a way of understanding that's maybe a little bit beyond, I don't know, like elsewhere. I guess. So that was a long.
Well, okay. Yesterday, Adrian Piper had some very interesting question for the panelists. Do you have some question for to this morning's presentations?
I think maybe. Right. Yeah, I think maybe because today's presentations were closer to my presentation, I need more time to absorb what was done, but maybe they'll show up later.
Of also students and people involved, and and yeah, priority to yesterday's panelist, of course. Roja has a question, and then we'll open to the audience.
Yeah, so thank you for all your presentations. There's a lot to absorb, so I think hopefully my question doesn't sound too naive. But I'm wondering where, if both Sean and Adrian, you guys can talk a little bit about how you conceptualize the difference between artistic research and artistic production. In my mind, the idea of research in the sciences is the work itself, whereas research in the way that I'm sort of hearing is somehow a preparation for a work. Am I characterizing that correctly? And the other thing that I'm wondering too is in what point in the way that you're describing artistic research in your part 4, does the idea of audience come into the picture? And for Julia, I wanted to hear more about, you spoke about the over-affirmation of a problem in order to account for that problem or reach a kind of solution, a temporary solution for that problem. How does that work? Yeah, those are my questions. Thank you.
Well, I finished my education before artistic research came along, so this is going to be an armchair answer rather than a hands-on, involved answer. One thing that happened for me as the result of getting seriously interested in philosophy and deciding to go back to school and study it was that it really freed up my artwork to not be theory-laden, the artwork itself. The work that I did before that was very involved with issues of space and time and perception and the relation between subject and object and the nature of the present moment. And when I look back on that work now, I see it using traditional philosophical concepts in really, you know, a pretty interesting way, but also really crazy, really crazy, you know, very idiosyncratic. And the process for me of doing that work was exciting because it opened my mind. You know, I just started reading a lot of philosophy and thinking about it and thinking about my situation. And I suppose retrospectively, you could call that a process of artistic research. But at the time, it was just part of my creative process. That's the way I thought about it. When I started studying philosophy systematically, I allocated a space in my life towards that activity of opening my mind through reading philosophy. And that freed up my work to be completely intuitive. You know, so I don't do any kind of complex intellection or complex conceptualization when I do my work. The work comes up in my mind. I figure out what's going on, whether I want to realize it or not, how I want to realize it, and then I just do it. And it usually takes me about 5 to 10 years to figure out what it all means for me. I think I better stop here. You know more about these issues.
Well, what I do know about is that the artistic research within the university context, being a kind of new invention, means that they're still kind of working out exactly what the difference is or what the relationship is between research and production, and that there's no consensus, I guess, among the different places that actually have arts PhDs, like, which aren't all that many in the scheme of things. And I just made a quick list as to what they are. And so when you said, does the research come before the production? Well, that might be something like within research-based arts practices, or let's say that there's a process of research that then maybe leads to the production of something. But then within the literature of like arts PhDs, there's these ideas of practice-led research and practice-as research, which maybe then are like two other orientations. So if you think about practice-led research, that says that the production comes first, and then the research maybe kind of happens right at the stopping point of that and on, as a sort of process of reflection maybe. And then of course all of them sort of assume a feedback loop where the research then informs the practice, and then the entire sorry if this is like boring. I'm just like completely immersed in it because I have to come to terms with it in order to like make my way through the institution. But it seems as though it's incumbent upon every researcher to sort of articulate exactly what that relationship is between the research and the production, and that it's not a given. It's something that's sort of articulated through every research project.
From the public programs point of view, of course, the research is always, and ideally, like I try to allude to with like the cyclical search and research simultaneously all the time, like from my point of view. I mean, whether that be artistic or curatorial, that's like another really complicated question, curatorial research. We didn't talk about it yet, but it's a similar kind of, and I'm not also actually over-invested into those definitionary things, but what I think is really, really important, just to like a little bit to answer to that for me very much in the work, and then come to Carson's question, is that method and madness, which is that I found that so beautifully put, and also that that was like a really moving part for me, even though so well articulated, and it made me think of Artaud, for example. Like, made me think of, I mean, even of course there's a lot of madness, but I think I'm very skeptical always also about this distinction of, you know, the free, mad, crazy, and you know, the research and investigation, and I think this idea of like the researching, or like maybe it's a spiraling process or something, and in that sense I would hope, because that was also very nice, like the instigation and the exploration, I hope it would spiral outwards then, I guess, from like the madness as like personal sickness or whatever. So that just as an answer to the before and after, I guess. And yeah, the thing with the over-affirmation, it's something I think about a lot recently, try also to do more systematic actually, because maybe that's the only thing where I would agree to be accelerationist or something. But I think particularly speaking about institutions, infrastructure, and I'm actually very happy to be at the Kunsthalle and have a platform from which I can host and, you know, redistribute resources, be it visibility or finances, and also at least, you know, try to establish some sort of a culture of generosity in public discourse and debate, which you need, you know, some sort of a place to stand from. So I think the over-affirmation part is really when something is very much at stake for you. Like in terms of the shifts of criticality that, you know, with the shifts of feminism, institutional critique or conceptual art have I think made a turn in general towards a more embedded or implicated position to be able to speak from or to articulate your critical stance from. It absolutely matters. And Donna Hayward was super important for me in that, to understand, like, if it doesn't, if, you know, you even think you can withdraw yourself from that to a moment that there's no relationship between you and the object of critique anymore, then why do it anyway? Or how even, you know, how can you then know what you talk about or what you critique, or how it can even be better, or imagine an alternative? I think is only possible then. But that was a little bit too general. What you mean is, how does it actually work? And I think I actually really believe in a critique as imploding something also, like a deadly embrace. Like you hug something you hate so firmly, it just suffocates. I think that's the answer.
Hello, sorry, this is another question for Julia. So Elise kind of described the Young Girl Reading Group as like an examination or re-examination of like feminist texts in a new or different context. And this is a really basic question, but I just wanted to know if you thought that the Tikkun book is a feminist text. So it's basically a yes or no answer. Is Theory of the Young Girl a feminist text? do you think?
The first one,
Yeah.
yeah, that's hard for me to answer because I haven't been at those first conversations they had about. But if you ask me, myself, and I about it,
well, I'd like to. Actually, I'd like to know your opinion, and also
Yeah.
I'd be intrigued to see what they made of that book as well.
yeah, no, that's since I can't and or refuse to access the Facebook and various documentations of their first conversations. It's just via them talking to me now, 2 years later. So it's going to be a very fuzzy answer, and also speaking for them. Of course, I felt even doing too much today. But for me, that book, the theory of preliminary thought younger, was really important and empowering. I mean, I think in that sense, I would consider it a feminist book, particularly also because it's not reduced to biological gender, because it looks at this construction, right, of like the young girl as this kind of imperative to consumerism, to affective relationships, all kinds of things. So I think as a critique of this, how would you call it, like the simulacrum is of course not the right word, but the template, so to speak. Let's say it post-digitally, like the template for all kinds of relationships today, social relationships, and also, of course, depoliticization and all that comes along with it, is, to my understanding, a relevant feminist point. And because it does so via, kind of these gendered, can I not be a native speaker too? I would say protocols then, yes. Like, so it activates certain gender protocols towards like a general exploitative situation to me. So that's why I believe in it, and I agree and support like the development from that text in the reading group on towards, for example, which the thing that was most mind-opening for me recently was reading Les Urbaines on this, because the text is from '77, and we read it, and it was so utterly contemporary to us. So that was it's hard to explain what was. We were reading it like we were actually saying it. Also, it's like a fictional text. It's a different genre, so to speak. But reading Les Urbaines in the like before the backdrop of the Tikkun, for me made terribly much sense, very much.
I guess I found it a really problematic book, actually. I didn't find it, I didn't find the language, the use of the young girl as an analogy for basically like all the kind of, like, as the last bastion of like the consumerism or whatever. I didn't find that useful, and I think that the language can be quite violent in that way, and I think there were good points in it, but I didn't think it was a particularly feminist text. So that's not really a question, it's just a statement.
I would totally agree to like the violence to it a little bit, or let's say it's more like a rhetorics of violence that you probably mean. But then again, look, in a show that we did with Renate and Pauline, we had a piece, an homage to Valerie Solanas and the Scum Manifesto, which I think nobody would refuse to be a feminist text in some way, or whatever it is or not. But I think there is, I understand like an aggression and an anger to it. But me personally, and like in my political motivation, I would subscribe to that rather than.
Thank you very much. Are there some more questions? Maybe. Yeah. Federica Martini was the co-curator of the first edition of the Symposium 2 years ago.
Yeah. So, first of all, thanks to the three of you for these very generous and thought-provoking talks. And I think it's very interesting also to touch upon the subjects of artistic research today, also because we are Yeah, I mean, what I really appreciated in your talks is that we really address some critical questions, and we get away from the stereotype of artistic research self-reflection. Of course, it's very important, I think, for any discipline to think about itself, but at the same time, I think we've heard so many times titles such as those, "Who's afraid of artistic research?" or "What is artistic research doing?" without never addressing the issue of methodology, for example. And I think this issue of cross-disciplinarity is very important also for financial reasons. And I was very interested also in listening to Julia PhD, for example, like as an art historian going to an art school to do a PhD. So I think this cross-disciplinarity, when we talk about artistic research today, is happening in quite unexpected ways, in a sense, and like we're increasingly trying to attract in our schools today also academicians coming from other contexts in order to develop these departments. And one of the questions I would have is also going back to what Sean was introducing this morning about creating a platform for critical thinking outside the institution. If there is a chance for artistic research to take place outside the institution.
Yes. Yeah, I suppose, gosh, how to answer? I mean, obviously that comes along with giving up a number of things. Like by being outside of an institution, you give up access to certain resources, you give up maybe some form of wage. You give up access, yeah, again, to libraries. That's resources, I suppose. Space for a peer group, but of course you can reconstruct a lot of those things. So those are, let's say, the infrastructures. You can reconstruct some of those, but yeah, I suppose from the point of view, from the perspective of methodologies, you're sort of asking, like, can you create kind of culture or space that will support the kind of what is artistic research? Is that the question, or seems like not?
Yes, I think partly yes. One of the things that kind of emerged implicitly is the relationship between fundamental research and applied research. Like when we had the Bologna Declaration coming over, like here in Europe, and giving this task of artistic research also to institutions that were not universities at the time, the idea was also that somehow, if as an artist you want to be a researcher, you have to be within a specialized institution. And of course, this goes with the funding. But for example, when symposia are organized in artistic research, we had a recent experience here in Switzerland. Independent artists presenting themselves as researchers were not invited.
Okay. I was told to hold this closer to my mouth. It's better. You know, as you were asking the follow-up question, I realized something, and it's before I entered this PhD program, I never identified as a researcher, and I would have no motivation to. So I guess the question of, like, is it possible outside? Well, maybe, but I would have no interest in doing it, come to think of it. Yeah, I guess when you're asking the question, I realized actually how much I identify research with the institutional form of the university, and that I didn't necessarily see the need to articulate the practice that I was doing as research prior to entering the university. But yeah, of course, I have to speak the language of the university in order to be a part of it, and so now research. So I'm perhaps like not very well fit to answer the question, and I'll pass it.
This is really a complicated question. I'd like to answer it from the perspective of being an academic researcher in philosophy. And you know, this goes along with my argument that research is just basically research no matter who does it. I can think of some situations in which it would be very difficult to do research if you were not in an institution. If you're doing basic science research and you need a laboratory and you need assistance and you need equipment, that would be very hard to manage if you didn't have institutional support. But there are other areas, and I would include philosophy in this, in which actually doing that research is very cheap. You know, if you have a laptop and a public library, you can find the information you need, and you can write the papers, and you can read other people's papers, and you can attend conferences. You can do those things provided you have an independent financial form of support. Now, up to very recently, at least for artists of my generation, it was taken for granted that you would find a low-stress day job so that you could spend your main time producing your work. So at the moment in philosophy, it's really very, very difficult because there are lots of cutbacks, departments are being closed, positions are being cut, people are being let go, or they're being forced to work under horrible working conditions. And people are now starting to confront the question, you know, do I want this life badly enough to accept the daily humiliations of having to work under these conditions? And I feel, speaking now as an artist, as though I'm just shouting at people who can't hear me. Get a day job. Go out and get a day job. Drive a cab. Run an office. Become a waitress. There are lots of things you can do that can support you financially while you do the research that you like to do. Now, this only works if you're really interested in that research. If it's simply that you want a job and the university won't give you one, then you know, this won't work. But if you're really curious about the stuff you're researching, just take your laptop and go to the library. Sorry.
Other questions?
Yeah.
And then you. No?
Yeah, I guess Adrian, you summarized that research could go in any region or research or field, but I mean, when I think of research, I look into the Defense Department. And J.P. Guilford, he was a theorist to look into creativity and how you can educate creativity. I mean, it's a big philosophical question. And he was funded by the Defense Department in California. And I mean, during the times of conceptual art that happened in California Institute of Arts, I mean, this is at this kind of a very parallel time, I guess. But I mean, I don't have a day job. I somehow was able to fund my research through alternative means by selling drawings or something. But I mean, I guess the question is about anthropology, and I mean, you talk about science and art, and this has a big backing by the Defense Department too. But in anthropology, when you are researching, I guess you run into the means of a cultural relativity or ethnocentricity, and it's a subjective view. But I mean, I wonder how you can overcome getting grants and stuff when you're actually doing work that is being suppressed, suppressed histories. I mean, I talk maybe about oral histories, or in terms of the colonized people, or things like this.
When you talk about work that's being suppressed, who is suppressing it?
By the governments.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in specific to right now, the Korean government in South Korea, that the woman president is actually rewriting the textbooks about, and is not talking about the coup d'etat that happened. Her father was the dictator for 18 years. And I mean, this is directly my research. And I mean, in serious matters, I tried to get funding from institutions, but they reject anything that is political. And it's not political, it's about memory politics, huh?
It's very difficult for me to speak to this because I don't know cultural anthropology as a field well enough to know what kind of funding you would need in order to do the oral histories that you need to do in order to pursue your work. So this is a very superficial answer. I guess it's not obvious to me why it would be impossible to simply live in the communities you need to live in order to do the oral histories you need to do and collect the data you need to collect. And probably many of those communities would be less expensive to live in on a daily basis than, for example, you know, Los Angeles, say.
Yeah, I mean, I went on, I did tons of field work in Korea for 3 years, and I mean, going through the archives of the institution and oral histories and whatnot, I mean, it's, I guess you could say it's quite difficult to, when you just think about the aspect of the archive and collecting data. It's fairly easy if you just have a computer and you have some knowledge and you can investigate into very tangible forms, but after production, where does this become either exhibited, turned into an exhibition? Does it turn into publication or film? I mean, there's many different types of outlets for research. And I guess that could be the question too. I mean, what is the final product, or how does it become synthesized or refined and reach out to the public? Is it a symposium? Is it a lecture? Or is it a book, or just a website? Or I don't know.
Well, I'll just share my experience of what I did after getting kicked out of the field of philosophy.
Oh, nice.
You know, of course, I continued to know the people I knew before I got kicked out. And as it happened, I got kicked out the same year that I finished this huge manuscript in philosophy that I'd been working on for a really long time. Now, in that field, if you have a website or a Facebook page, and you can make your texts into PDF documents, then all you need is a little business card that you carry around with you to every professional conference you go to. And when you get into conversations with people about your work, you just give them the card. They go to the website, they download the work, and then you engage in conversation with them. It's cheap.
It's effective, yeah.
I cannot not so much speak about this, but the funny thing is that my dissertation on the institution critique had a case study of ETA in the Basque Country, and I got a grant for, weirdly enough, from there, like the Basque Ministry of Culture, to research that, which was, I think, not exactly as difficult probably as your situation, but like similarly kind of complicated, like who you're accountable to, what can you do, how can you then speak to the people you want to speak to if you come with that context or money. And over-affirmation doesn't work there, I realized, but opacity is something I learned from the people I talked to there, like in the field of like institutional critique as like institution in general, not like art organization, right, but like broader institutional fights. I mean, I've confessed already that I'm not a pacifist, but I think there are strategies in that context of, you know, spaces of conflict, like camouflage, and that can be subsumed under tactics of opacity that would enable you, I believe, or I found it convincing in that context, to place criticism in ways that are not equally legible to anybody. I mean, it's a question also of, you know, the literacy of the science or whatever you're going to use. And can say that also to coming from the GDR and having grown up there with musician and activist parents who did the same. So I think it's a question of how explicit you want to give away your critique, or how sustainable or like infiltrated, or what you actually want to achieve, right? If you want to protest, of course, then that's a different thing, but can, I think, you know, subcutaneously achieve things with a little bit of a mimicry moment.
Thank you. I think there was a hand over there.
I just have a very first question for Adrian, because we have you here, and I wanted to ask more like a personal question maybe. So I was asking myself all the time, why such a artist who started with conceptual art and also kind of connections to LSD movement, counterculture, and all this. Also, you did work on yoga. How such a person then is not mentioning when she is doing philosophy, people like Deleuze or Guattari, or like other people like Brian Masumi or Erin Manning, but instead is referring to Kant and Hegel, and it's like a diagonal. So like, if you would have been doing like very minimal art, or, you know, like very clean art, then maybe it would be a direct connection to Kant somehow, I would imagine, but you made like a diagonal, so maybe you can comment on that, or I suppose it's more productive than to do this.
Thank you, Shintaro Miyazaki, who was also a panelist yesterday.
Should I answer? Okay. Actually, I did do minimal art for quite a while. I produced a lot of work before I then moved to thinking about words and pieces of paper as themselves objects. So I did go, in fact, that standard route. But the thing to say is that at the time that I got interested in philosophy in the 60s, at that time, everyone was interested in analytic philosophy. Everyone. Jasper Johns was reading Wittgenstein, so of course everyone had to read Wittgenstein. The art language group was reading Austin and Ryle and Quine. You know, analytic philosophy was the area of philosophy that was the focus of attention. Well, at that point, it hadn't emerged. Continental philosophy was basically 19th century philosophy, which is, you know, which comes from Kant. My personal route into philosophy, you know, what really got me going with it was writing an essay on space and time as forms of perception for a catalog, and having a friend of mine who was a philosophy major tell me that I needed to read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and particularly the Transcendental Aesthetic, and reading that part of the text and thinking, oh, well, Kant and I are talking about the same thing. And so, you know, Kant was the direct source. I think you can jump into the water at any point, really.
Okay, thanks to everybody for the presentations. And I have a question for Adrian Piper. So, yeah, thanks for your 4 very insightful distinctions. And I was wondering if I understood you well, that you see these 4 points as possible definitions, and that finally that the 4th definition of artistic research as research would be a synthesis or like a conclusive statement that involves or integrates knowledge and investigation and exploration. And if this is a final or like at least working hypothesis of how you could define artistic research, could you then just explore a little bit this? And because I'm wondering, particularly to this aspect, if it's a defining investigation, I'm interested in it because I'm working in the field of art and history of science. And while working in history of science, when I work on scientists, on some particular scientists, I realize that I do rather history of research, because if you do history on medical science or psychotherapy or psychiatrist, you're not dealing exclusively with science, because a psychiatrist or a medical doctor qualifies its work in relation to patients, and so research is really at the center of this practice. So my question is more, is your way to be informed in definitions of artistic practice, may this have an impact also on other disciplines such as history of science, or where if you go deeper into practice you realize that you cannot use the same categories anymore?
What I wanted to say was that yes, it is true that artistic research includes all of these different modes of inquiry, but so do other fields. And I wanted to conclude that although there are many situations in which it makes sense for artists to do research, there is no particular mode that is exclusively artistic research. If they're doing research, then they're exploring, they're investigating, they're analyzing, they're questioning, they're solving problems. They're doing all the things in the particular order and the particular way they need to do them that people in other fields are doing in different ways, with different training, different procedures, different methodologies. But the components of information gathering and the ways in which curiosity is expressed really cannot be codified in terms of different fields. That was the main thing that I wanted to say. Who may have virtually nothing else in common to communicate at a very basic level about issues ranging from the basic to the complex. And I think that really has to be preserved and protected. So anytime I find a term which has loaded political and social content being appropriated into another context in which it is made to do double duty, bringing the validation of the original context into a new context that is seeking validation, I get really nervous, because I feel that the main point and the value and the purpose of conventional language is being violated. And that's the way I felt when I first started hearing about artistic research. I, of course, understand completely that there are economic imperatives in the background of this development, and I take those very seriously. But I think that if artistic research is to achieve the kind of validation that it's seeking, it needs to follow a procedure that respects the requirements of ordinary communication. And it needs to use the concept of artistic research in a way which enables the artistic researchers to be intelligible to academic administrators, to granting fund panels to foundations, to governments. And as soon as language starts getting this fuzzy, blurry, sort of ambiguous use, which of course we can all do. We can all do that anytime we like. It becomes harder to communicate.
Like Lukács and Adorno writing on it, and even prior to that, Walter Pater, this idea that it's something that's methodically unmethodical or systematically unsystematic. So this kind of form that's already kind of embracing the contradiction between accepting sort of external constraints and developing an internal logic. To me, it seemed like, oh, maybe this is a conversation that didn't just start in the last 15, 20 years around artistic research, but it's been, going on much longer with regards to systematic thought.
Yeah, well, it's hard for me. I think I need to quote here from this. Like, I feel bad, actually, because for me it's difficult to understand from which position I should be talking now. The head of education of the Documenta 13, who's excessively argued for and against all these things, or like my own training, who's I did a dissertation on institutional critique that I couldn't get done in any art historical department in Germany, so I did it at the Art Academy in Vienna. And at that time, my professor was just implementing a PhD program there. So it's like a lot of different contexts for me going on here. Maybe like to be, most bluntly, I'd say I feel like in my work and personally also no pity for the institution of language to be violated, and that comes from like the kind of third wave institutional critique work I've been studying and supporting, is that I believe really that the grammar is like it's a fundamental disciplinary mechanism that
So my first question goes to Adrian, because I guess we just listened to your really amazing paper, but then I would also like Sean and Julia to give their opinion, because maybe this question can be applied to your practices too. So Adrian, you said you have no self-interest in writing this paper, so I was actually very curious to know, why did you feel the need of giving us such advice?
Well, number one, I really love giving people free advice. So that's the first thing. And I was invited to give a paper on this topic, and loving to give free advice on any topic, I, of course, accepted the invitation. But now, I guess, the serious answer to your question is that, I take this distinction between artistic language and conventional language very seriously. The artistic language is the language that I personally develop in my artwork, and that every artist develops in her or his artwork. And that language is idiosyncratic, it's unique, it speaks to some people, it doesn't speak to a lot of people. Sometimes it takes centuries for it to speak to people. And that's just part of producing art. You just have to live with that. The great thing about conventional language is that it is based on a shared set of criteria for meaning and reference. And so it enables people.
That I think is important to unpack, not only in idiosyncratic ways, or like the poetry or the fuzziness that you have excellently, of course, outlined its limitations, but I believe, of course you need, all the funding, and I'm not saying like any research or anything can be done without money whatsoever. That would be utterly naive, but I believe if that aim of ordinary communication, as you said, or like any kind of normative administrative policy would be the motivation of artistic research, I wouldn't want to do it, I guess. That's just like my response.
Now, I was wondering, in Switzerland we have various examples now in the last 10 years maybe of experiences made between science and art to invite artists in residencies, for example, in the science department of the University of Geneva or at the CERN in Geneva also, etc., with always very, I would say, good results, whatever that means. I mean, people are very enthusiastic about it on both sides, either the artist and the people, the scientists that kind of discover art and new ways of seeing their own work. Is this kind of thinking that is being more and more common a good way maybe to address your conclusions that you had in your talk, and also the idea of you said your first point was to say be also interested in the other disciplines, and yeah, well, this is kind of my question.
Well, I just want to say that this is harder to convey the value of what it is you're trying to achieve, and therefore harder to get things done, like get money. So that's what really got under my skin.
Sean, can you also maybe explain about your own motivations? I guess maybe to.
Yeah, I'll do my best.
Thanks.
I'm afraid that my natural mode is kind of fuzzy. So, no, just wait. Just wait until I answer this question. Then you'll see how fuzzy I can get. But I mean, I think I also felt uncomfortable when I first learned of artistic research, particularly within kind of a university context. And yet I found myself in a kind of art practice PhD. And so I feel at some level like maybe I ought to explain myself. Or, because in one way, I don't see it I don't see it purely as a way to justify myself to administrators in order to get money. Certainly, I'm there because I have a scholarship from the state of Australia. So, you know, these sorts of considerations are a part of it. But I think that there is even a question as to like some methodologies that might be sort of native to art. And so it doesn't need to look across to other fields to find more established ones. But then the question is, you know, what might those be? And especially because there's the kind of contradiction between the rigor of the other fields, and I mean, I think your paper sort of illustrated it so beautifully. But one thing that it made me think of was in my research in particular, I'm looking at the history of the essay form, for instance, which over its 500 years, and particularly in the last century with